Hi, and welcome to week one in Intro to Psychology, and we're going to look at what is psychology. Now, I remember when I entered in post-secondary to study psychology, that was in the 1975-76, and it was funny how many people, family, friends, who kind of laughed it off a wee bit, psychology. And still today, when I meet people and the topic psychology comes up, it's pretty common to hear comments like, "Oh, great, now you're going to analyze me," or "I don't need to say anything. You're just pretty much going to anticipate and read my mind," sort of thing. And like these comments from friends and family, many of you know something about psychology. But what if I asked the question, what is psychology? What would you tell me? Intuition, common sense, behavior analysis, mind reading, any number of things do come up. After this introduction, I'm going to show you a list of 10 true and false statements to test common beliefs. Now, you might be surprised at what you might find out about psychology. And I'll first, a few points about psychologists. Psychologists don't read minds, although they sometimes think they can or want to convince you that they can. Not all psychologists can analyze you, or even want to, with any sort of accuracy, that is, but they do know a lot about why and how we think and behave in certain ways. Psychologists use a scientific, measurable methods to explain our behavior and thinking process, and it's to this point that we're going to focus in this chapter. So how much do you know about psychology? You're going to see a list, I think on this side, true and false questions. Pause the video, look at them, answer them true or false, and at the end of this video I'll give you an indicator of what the correct answers were. So let's begin. Psychology as a science. Well, by definition, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and the mental processes. Now, I mentioned scientific study. It uses a scientific method, which is an orderly, systemic procedure that researchers follow. Now, this is the approach that all sciences are based on for different topics of study. Things like biology, sociology, and a lot of other health sciences, they also use the scientific method. They all include the following processes. First, identify the research problem. Secondly, design a study to investigate the problems. 3, collect and analyze data. Draw conclusions, and then communicate your findings. Now, in psychology, there are 4 goals of psychology. The first goal is to describe what's happening. Researchers will make notes about what has occurred, either behaviorally or a mental process, as accurately and as completely as possible. Now, the observations are the data. Now, usually a good starting point when pursuing any new area of study is to do a description. Secondly, explaining why is this happening under the understanding of conditions of behavior and mental processes, confirmed by ruling out or ruling in alternatives, cause and effect. Under what circumstances? That's number 2. 3, when, that is predicting, when will it happen again? Now, under prediction, you're identifying the conditions under which the behavior or mental process occurs. That if we understand that, then we can begin to predict when and under what conditions something is likely to occur. And if we're able to predict, then we can, 4, control. How can it be changed? By applying principles to prevent unwanted occurrences or bring about desired outcomes. Now, you and I are not scientists who routinely use the scientific principle and goals in the study of psychology. We can, however, use some other very important skills that we could use every day and in our education. And these are critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is the thoughtful analyzing and probing questions, statements, and arguments of others. Critical thinking helps us to sort truth from fiction. To be a skeptic is important. Take nothing for granted, not believing just because things are in print or were spoken or written by an authority. Now, some principles of critical thinking can include, as I mentioned earlier, be skeptical. Insist on seeing evidence. Examine definitions and terms. Sometimes research, if it doesn't define the terms, how do we know what they're studying? Examine the assumptions or the premise of arguments. Be cautious in drawing conclusions from evidence. Consider alternative interpretations of research. Avoid oversimplifying or overgeneralizing. Now, when we consider research, in particular with psychology, there are two forms of research. There's basic or pure research, and then there's applied research. Now, basic research, it's conducted to seek out new knowledge and explore and advance general scientific understanding. The applied research, it's conducted specifically to solve practical problems and improve the quality of life. Now, we'll come back to the research components in part 2 of this chapter, which will be posted in week 2. So you might be wondering, where did psychology come from? Now, historically, we can look back to the ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle for some initial exploration into what we now know as psychology. It was Socrates who coined the phrase, "know thyself," as the root of psychology, and the way to do this is through introspection, or, looking within yourself for explanations for why you do what you do. Now, this introspection, or the careful examination of one's own thoughts and emotions, in order to achieve greater self-knowledge. And it was Aristotle who argued that human behavior, like the movement of the stars and the seas, is subject to rules and law. In his book named Parapsyche, Aristotle covered topics including personality, sensation, perception, thought, intelligence, needs and motives, feelings and emotions, and memory. So, as we begin this history of psychological thought and historical view in mind and behavior, some of our initial beginnings were many, many, many years ago. We're going to begin our explanation into the roots of psychology by reviewing the development of psychology as a laboratory science during the second half of the 19th century. So let's get started. With the 19th century contributions, we'll begin with Gustav Theodor Fechner. From about 1881 to 1887, he published in 1866 his landmark book, Elements of Psychophysics, which showed how physical events would be like light and sound, are related to psychological sensations and perceptions. Now, some consider this exploration the beginning of psychology. What followed, or grew out of that, was what's known as structuralism. In 1879, German philosopher and physician Wilhelm Wundt performed an experiment to measure the lag time between the instant a person heard a sound and the instant they pushed the button, indicating that they had heard it. Now, that's a simple experiment, but Wundt's experiment was so significant because it was about the workings of the brain. It was the first attempt to study a mental process in a quantitative manner. Now, quantity or quantitative is a number-based, so you count. So how many seconds lagging between when you hear a sound and when you push a button? And that's what was so interesting about what he was studying, and it was quantitative. He also developed a technique of objective introspection, which involves the process of objectively examining and measuring one's own thoughts and mental activities. One of Wundt's students, E.B. Titchener, he wanted to search for the basic elements or the basic structures of mental thought. Now, this approach to examining thought, looking at structures, became known as structuralism. The most common way of studying these structures was through a process known as introspection, where the subject is asked to report on their thoughts and feelings about what's going on around them. The structuralist view died out when Titchener died in 1927. Functionalism, what William James proposed, a countering point of view to structuralism, and he called it functionalism, in which the way the mind allows us to adapt is stressed. Functionalism is concerned with the study of the mental processes and the role in adapting to the environment. Influenced heavily by Darwin's book on the origin of species and the means of natural selection, was very instrumental in the movement of functionalism towards another faction of psychology history in terms of behavioralism. Now, behaviorism views observable, measurable behaviors as the appropriate subject matter rather than anything about internal states. After all, behavior can be seen and heard, therefore it can be measured. Emphasizes the environment as a key role as a determinant of behavior. Now, we're going to revisit a lot of this area in the area of Skinner in the learning chapter later on in this semester. Now, another facet of psychology that emerges, what's known as Gestalt. Now, Gestalt psychology was founded by Max Wertheimer in the early 1900s. Now, Wertheimer, he criticized structuralism and introspection as approaches of being unscientific. You can't measure what's going on inside your head. Gestalt psychology argues that our brain takes stimuli and arranges them into meaningful wholes. Now, this is not H-O-L-E-S holes in the ground, wholes as in complete parts. So wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S. Now, he also called these wholes gestalts, which are greater than the sum of the parts. So Gestalt psychology can be demonstrated really in neat ways. You'll see the examples that I've provided. Gestalt psychology suggests, and later research confirms, that our minds are programmed not necessarily to see the world the way it really is, but in a way that it's useful for us for understanding. Now, this we're going to revisit with one of our journals when we look at consciousness. Now, one faction of psychology you might be more familiar with is psychoanalysis, maybe only by the name. Now, Freud's theory was influenced by the sexually repressed Victorian age in which it was developed, in which he lived. Freud proposed that the unconscious mind and conflict. Let me repeat that. Freud proposed that the unconscious mind and the conflict controls much of our conscious behavior in his theory of psychoanalysis. More current perspectives, the theorists that we have just looked at, still influence psychology, but these ones that we're going to be doing are more contemporary. And we'll begin with evolutionary psychology. This studies how humans have adapted the behaviors required for survival in the face of environmental pressures over the long course of evolution. They consider the different pace of development between our mind and the environment we live in. Now, one of the more significant ones, and we'll revisit this again several times, is the biological or the physiological psychology. Now, this looks for the links between specific behaviors and specific biological processes. There is an emphasis on the role of heredity, genetics, neurotransmitters, and other biological processes, and the effect on behavior and mental processes. normal, abnormal. Neuroscience combines the work of psychologists, biologists, biochemists, medical researchers, and others, and studies the structure and function of the nervous system. Now, I've posted a video by Alan Jones' talk, and it's called Mapping the Brain, and I'll put it into week 2 folder, and it just gives you an idea that even, I think that video might be 12 years old, what was being done then. More current work in the area of brain mapping is quite significant. The next one we're going to look at is cognitive psychology, which focuses on the mental processes. When you hear mental processes, think thinking, such as memory, problem solving, and decision making. It views humans as active participants in their environment. One of the most prominent theories of psychology is humanistic existentialist psychology, and it focuses on the uniquenesses of human beings and their capacity for choice. It emphasizes positive views of human nature. The hierarchy of needs you've probably seen before and are familiar is Maslow's theory of motivation. It focuses on free will and the human potential for growth. It was developed by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, among others, as a reaction to the deterministic nature of behavioralism and psychoanalysis. Learning perspective. This is from the behavioral to the cognitive studies that they study the effect of the experience on behavior. Learning through repetition and reinforcement. Learning is essential in describing, explaining, predicting, and controlling behavior, and this is one we'll visit again in a later chapter. Social cognitive theorists suggest that people can modify or even create their environments. Intentional learning by observing others. Gaining influence in the areas of personality development, psychological disorders, and psychotherapy. Now, sociocultural approach, well, this is also quite a bit different, and it's contemporary, and it views that social and cultural factors may be just as powerful as evolutionary and physiological factors in affecting behavior and mental processes. The role of culture in understanding differences is critical to understanding other people's behavior, relationships, and expectations. So that was a fairly quick overview, and you'll find a lot of my videos will be somewhat like that, where I'll create and explain some things maybe in a little differently than it does in your text. They're not as long and not comprehensive. They're meant to be an aid to help you to work along with your book and put highlights in your book and make notes. Now, I did say at the end of this video that I would give you some responses to the true and false questions. Now, for your little quiz that you did at the very beginning of this video, all the even questions are true. All the odd questions are false. So you may want to go back to the beginning of the video, look at those questions, check what you've marked on, and just review them to see just how much you knew about psychology. I'm hopeful that this will be a course you're going to enjoy. This course, of course, is all about you. Psychology is the study of what makes you tick, your behavior, your mental processes, and how we are all similar and yet how we're all different. So I really hope you enjoy this course. Good luck, and we'll start looking at research in week 2. Bye for now.